1746, a college was established in a small town in central New Jersey under a charter from the King of England. This college, which was destined to become one of the most prestigious universities in the world, was originally called the College of New Jersey. In 1896, at the sesquicentennial, the trustees voted to change the name. You would recognize it immediately, of course, Princeton University, one of the leaders in the world in science and technology, engineering, as well as liberal arts and fine arts. The university has been known traditionally as a place of excellence in academic affairs, but also a place of religious diversity and vitality. I had many professors when I studied at the university who were from varying ranges of atheism or agnosticism all the way to devout faith in many of the world's religions. An interesting fact that I uncovered a few years ago is that there is a group of Princeton professors that have a very articulate faith in Jesus Christ. These Christian professors banded together as a group called the Princeton Faculty Forum. I had the privilege of helping to sponsor some talks on the Princeton campus by leading Christian intellectuals from around the world, beginning in 1988. And our collaboration with that group has been very exciting. I'd like to have you be a part of that experience. I'm Tom Woodward. I'm a professor at Trinity College of Florida, and I direct the Center for University Ministries, which is sponsoring the program that goes on every year at Princeton University with the Princeton Faculty Forum. Let's journey to Princeton, New Jersey, and meet some of the professors and hear about their personal faith, their academic work, and also see one of the talks that they presented on the university campus just a short while ago. Dr. Bocarsley, thank you for taking time from your schedule to join us here in the studio so we could talk about your perspectives on Christianity here at Princeton University. And let me begin by asking you to share with me and with others who may be listening, what is your field? I know that you've been on the chemistry faculty at Princeton for, what, 15 years?
That's correct.
Okay. Could you tell us just a little bit about what area of chemistry that you have been dealing with over this period or in your training?
I'm an inorganic chemist, and my research interest has been in the area of solar energy conversion and novel chemical sensors.
Okay. Solar energy.
Yeah.
So like when people talk about those little solar cells on their handheld calculator or on their roof, you would know something about that.
That's right. We've been doing a lot of work with materials like that.
That's very practical. Let me ask you, let me begin in a provocative line of questioning here. I know that you have an interesting background story of how you became a Christian. We'll get to that later. But let's say some young student, college freshman, sophomore, maybe even one of your colleagues, someone on the campus who is open and interested in the possibility of considering Christianity as their life choice, their life commitment, but they have questions. They're skeptical. And they say, Dr. Bocarsley, or you know, in the case of one of your colleagues, Andy, what would you say if they asked you the question, what are the reasons? What are some of the intellectual reasons that you believe that Christianity is true? What would you say to them?
I think the most compelling reason as a chemist that I give, and has always been important to me, is that when one looks at nature and one looks at the complexity and yet the organization in nature, that you can't rationalize that in terms of some sort of random process, but that there's order there, there's thought there, and that it leads directly to the concept of a creator, God.
So in your work as a chemist, you don't see chemistry as a field that threatens the foundations of Christianity, but if anything, it tends to support it?
I think it builds, absolutely. Okay. I see no conflict there at all, and I think it's that the more we learn about how nature is put together and the wonderful things God does, it just confirms his existence.
Fascinating. Well, let me ask you to go back and tell me, in your personal pilgrimage to the Christian faith, can you give us kind of an overview of how that happened in your life? How did you become a Christian?
Sure. I'm Jewish, and I was raised as a conservative Jew, and as such, there was a certain amount of training that argued that one shouldn't even consider Christianity, that there wasn't really a basis for doing that. My exploration in this area started when I was a sophomore in college, and I ran into a woman actually in a chemistry lab, organic chemistry.
It's a nice place to meet somebody.
As an inorganic chemist, I keep on making bad jokes about organic chemistry, a little rivalry, whatever, but organic chemistry has been very good for me because in that laboratory I met this woman, and she witnessed to me, told me about her faith in God, which I understood as a Jew, but then further about Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior, which was a concept I had heard about, but really was fairly alien to me from an intellectual point of view. And we spent a lot of time, I guess politely I could say talking, but in fact arguing, intense discussions about this topic. And finally she directed me to the 53rd chapter of Isaiah, and she asked me to read that. And I read that.
Now, was this, you were both still in college?
This was both when we were sophomores.
Okay.
This is a year-long lab, sort of towards the end of the year. And we had become pretty good friends because of these discussions over that time. I read that, and I got very concerned when I read that because I also read some rabbinical commentaries that went with it, and what the rabbis were saying it meant and what it clearly meant were two different things. And as a result of that, I guess we argued more. I wasn't willing at all to give in at this point, but I tried some of these arguments out on her, these rabbinic arguments. That didn't sound too good to me, but see how they flew with her. And she told me afterwards that, in fact, she thought at that point that she was never going to see any change in me, that was probably the end of it. But in fact, that chapter had a dramatic impact on me and really caused me to start thinking. Things went on. Things didn't really change externally at that point. We grew in terms of our friendship. She continued to witness to me. And then later on, we graduated from college, and I went off to MIT to do graduate work, and she stayed in California where we were in school. She went to do graduate work at UC Davis. When I went to MIT, that was the first time I'd ever lived away from home. I was at UCLA as an undergraduate. I was commuting from home. I was under the influence of my family and old friends and whatnot. And at MIT, I had a chance to reevaluate everything because it was a whole new environment that I found myself in with people I didn't know and thoughts that were new and whatnot. And right after the term started, the Jewish high holidays came up, Rosh Hashanah, the New Year, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and I sought out the Hillel organization on campus for the services, and I went to the services, and I was sitting there at the Yom Kippur services, and it struck me as I was listening to the liturgy that all the things that Pat had been telling me and that I had read about in Isaiah, and then now she had also encouraged me to read some of the New Testament, so I had read some of that. All these things I had learned about Jesus Christ being our atonement were embodied in this service, and that the service without Jesus Christ didn't have any meaning. So at that point, I accepted Jesus into my life as my Lord and Savior.
Now that you were still in the doctoral program at MIT?
It was my first year at MIT.
Okay, very good.
And the nice ending of the story is after that, Pat, a year after that, became my wife. So.
Okay, well, I can see that it did have kind of a happy conclusion in both ways. That's great. Now, do I recall that your wife herself has her doctorate and is a college professor also?
That's correct. She's a professor of immunology at New Jersey School of Medicine and Dentistry.
Super, super. Keeping academic standards in the family, the whole family. That's great. Tell me a little bit about your view of the integration of, let's say, a Christian faith perspective. Now, I imagine in chemistry there's not a heavy amount of integration, but do you feel that a Christian can integrate chemistry, or can comfortably hold to, let's say, a Christian divine view of nature and still do good chemistry?
Certainly, I hope so. I'd say it's true that in terms of the lectures that I give in front of students, that the subject doesn't really run into questions of theology, and so it's hard to see the connection there, but I do an equal amount of work in terms of research, probably more work in terms of research, and there I'd say that my theology is intrinsic to my ability to do research, that it is by God's grace, first of all, that I have the insight to look at the problems that I look at, and that prayer has always been an important part of being able to do my job, both in terms of being able to teach and do research. And so I see those two things intertwined in my life completely, and there's really no conflict there.
Let me ask you a little bit more about your own faith perspective, Dr. Bokarsley. Now that you have made a commitment to Jesus Christ, you have believed in Him as your Lord, your Messiah, would you consider yourself still Jewish? In other words, can you put those two together? Can you be Christian and Jewish at the same time? What's your view on that?
Absolutely. There's this word conversion, which is a sort of painful word, because conversion in the normal usage talks about turning away from something to something else. And so when one talks about converting to Christianity, one has this picture of giving up something and accepting Christianity. However, I've always considered myself a Hebrew Christian or completed Jew, in that I see that the two religions are totally compatible. Of course, the Bible, the New Testament portion, is just an extension of the Old Testament. There's no conflict there. And I see in my life a fulfillment of my Jewish thought, my Jewish ideals in Christianity.
Okay.
Of course, our Lord and Savior was Jewish, and he didn't seem to have a conflict either in that area.
And about 98%, 95% of the New Testament is written by or with the help of Jewish men. That's great. Dr. Bocarsley, what have been some of the most important intellectual or maybe historical obstacles that you've confronted in either becoming a Christian or in growing in your faith? And how have you surmounted those obstacles?
Well, I think while many people's journey to becoming Christians has to do with important intellectual arguments, because of my Jewish background, I always accepted the existence of God. That was not a question with me per se. And again, I think that's been backed up, as we talked about earlier, by just the beauty and organization one finds in nature. Long before I became a chemist, I remember as a high school student, I was very interested in astronomy. I'd go out with my friends and look at the night sky, and just there it was very obvious to me, seeing the stars and the organization there and the beauty there, that this was not random, but that there was a creator. So the intellectual question about the existence of God has not really provided a stumbling block to me, but what has is what Jesus indicated would be, that he would be a stumbling block to the Jew, and that certainly has been the situation initially in my case, that modern Jewish thought is such that it's almost impossible to comprehend that the Savior has come and has already interacted with people on earth. And overcoming that and realizing that Jesus did fulfill the Old Testament prophecies was the door that opened up the possibility of becoming a Christian.
Excellent. I'm going to pose one more question, and that is, if Dr. Provine were to put up, the professor at Cornell were to put up on his door the same cartoon that he used in an article he wrote recently. The cartoon shows a brain bin, a little box containing human brains right by the front of a Gothic church door, suggesting that you have to check your brains before you enter the church door. And a student walked by this door, and you were walking with that student, and said, "What do you think of that?" In other words, you have to check out your brains to be a Christian. In other words, thinking people who think with rigor can't be Christians. What would you say to the student?
Well, I'd argue, again, from my own background, that, in fact, if I am to turn off my thought processes, then I never enter a church, okay, and I don't come to Jesus Christ. That my background is such that unless I very carefully examine the issues and use this very intensive intellectual approach and ask what can be true and what can be false and what follows and whether this is right or this other path is right, that I cannot accept Christianity as my religion. So it's always been a testing process with me, that I have to look at the issues and decide based on the information. I can't think of a more rigorous intellectual challenge than doing that.
So what you're saying is, in your case, it's as you enter the church door, put your brains on.
Absolutely.
Put them in high gear. Okay.
Correct.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time. Well, I'm delighted that Dr. John Suppy could join us here for a chat on the Princeton campus. Dr. Suppy, welcome to our studio.
Great, thanks, Tom.
Thank you for taking time out of your schedule. You're jetting out to California tomorrow?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Scientific work, I take it?
Yes, several things. I have to give a talk at Caltech, and then there's some meetings and
okay.
some
Wonderful.
research.
And I think that you said after that you're going to Barcelona, Spain to teach, what, in the university?
Well, no, I'm actually just doing research, working on a book for part of my sabbatical.
Good. Let me go ahead and add that for the background knowledge of what you've been doing. You've been at Princeton since 1971, is it?
That's right. That's right.
And have you been, what, in the geology department the whole time?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit about your background. Where did you study geology as you went through, the university system?
Well, I did grow up in Los Angeles, and I went to UC Riverside as an undergraduate, and then out to Yale as a graduate student.
Okay. So you got your doctorate at Yale.
That's right.
And then were hired to teach geology at Princeton.
That's right. That's right.
Interesting. What have been sort of your specialties, your emphases, in area of research?
Well, I'm a structural geologist. I deal with deformation in the earth, and that...
Deformation. Can you explain that word?
Well, folding, earthquakes, things like that,
Okay.
Mountain building.
Okay.
We actually even work on Venus right now. We've been doing quite a bit on the history of Venus.
The history of Venus.
That's right.
That's fascinating.
That's right.
Now, I've heard a rumor that you actually are one of the authors of a very significant paper on earthquakes. It's being talked about. Could you tell us just a tidbit about that?
Well, this just came out today, I think, in Science, and it's been in the news. But we have been working on the problem of identifying these hidden faults, blind thrust faults under Los Angeles and other places. And a whole group of us, a consortium of us that have been working on this, have come out with a paper essentially identifying what we know of these hazards now. And they're actually quite a bit more substantial than people have thought. So the sort of earthquakes that we've been having the last few years are fairly typical of what you can expect in Los Angeles and other places like San Francisco.
Well, I trust that your research continues to give practical applications to maybe even predicting quakes in that area. I was sharing with a professor and some students down in Florida a couple months back that the chairman of geology, I believe at that point you were chairman of geology at Princeton. Right. I said that the chairman of geology at Princeton is a committed Christian and has a very interesting story about how that happened, sort of this pilgrimage. Would you just share with me, sort of review with me again some of the highlights of that story of how you made your pilgrimage to the Christian faith while you were here at Princeton?
Sure. I've been a geologist much longer than I've been a Christian. I became a Christian in 1978, and, right here on Princeton campus. And I did grow up in a Christian family as a child, but I didn't really understand how you became a Christian. I didn't know whether it was true or not. I was basically an agnostic. I wasn't hostile to Christianity, though I certainly realized that we're often...
I can relate to agnosticism.
Right.
I was an agnostic too. Okay.
There's hypocrisy and things like that, and I didn't really understand, if I went to church, I didn't understand Christian jargon, and sometimes I felt that sermons were a little illogical, things like that, but basically I was quite open to whatever truth was out there, and I didn't know why Christianity should be true rather than some other religion. It certainly is a phenomenon that there are many different religions among humans, and so just because I grew up in LA doesn't mean that Christianity is true. And
you certainly saw a lot of religions out there.
Well,
different kinds of faith.
But basically it was, I didn't know how to find out what the truth is, and I wasn't around any Christians who could really explain to me what the truth was. And so this went on for many years. Eventually, my wife was a Christian, as a matter of fact. But I would say it was basically I had an ongoing hunger for something more to life. I've been very successful in my career, and here I am at Princeton University, and there are lots of wise and good people, but it seemed like something was missing, and so. When I'm at home, if I'm hungering for something, I start rattling around the kitchen. And so I started looking around. I went to, when I was at Yale, I would go to the church some. And at Princeton, I started going to the Princeton University Chapel. And it didn't bother my sense of logic. They had very logical sermons at the chapel. But what really spoke to me and kept me coming back was something different from that. And but I kept coming, and then finally one day there was a woman preaching there in that big chapel. It's like a cathedral, and she said, "You students here, you made it to the top college, the college of your choice, and you professors, you know more about your subject than anybody else in the world except for maybe 5 or 10 people, but you people have a kindergarten knowledge of Christianity. And that was like an arrow shot through that cathedral right into me, and that was absolutely true for me. I recognized that, and I realized that I really needed to start to look into Christianity. So I started reading books in my spare time. Eventually started to realize I really had to face up to who Jesus was.
Now, were you reading the Bible during this period? Did you actually read the Bible itself, or?
Well, I started to read really books about Christianity first, but then I realized it was really who was Jesus, because if Jesus is a wise man and a good man, I know lots of wise people around Princeton. That's not what I'm looking for. What I'm looking for is, is there some real significant meaning to life, and so I'd heard that the Gospel of Mark was perhaps the first gospel to be written down, so I started reading through the Gospel of Mark, and it was the first time I'd ever read through a book of the Bible as an adult, or I guess even as a child. I'd never done that. And as I read, I was obviously trying to do surgery on this, cutting away things that I was uncomfortable with, miracles and things like that. Was beyond my experience, certainly. And but overall, there was a ring of truth to it. And though if I cut away everything that I was uncomfortable with, it made no sense at all. And it was quite clear to me that from what the way Jesus acted and also what he said, as recorded in Mark, that he considered himself not to be a good and wise man, but to be God come to earth. And so that really struck me as an amazing thing that I had never really confronted before, that maybe this is true, that certainly the universe is a remarkable place, and to believe that it just popped into being by itself or it was created is equally as amazing stretch of faith. But so it seemed possible that God might be a loving God and might want to communicate with us in various ways, and that maybe Jesus is God come to earth. And I didn't know how you found out whether it's true or not, but for the first time in my life, I really considered that and pondered that. And then later, I kept going to the Princeton Chapel and started to, when I first went there, I was more of an observer, but then I started to take part more and more. And I actually was taking part in a communion service one morning, and the dean of the chapel, Dean Gordon, used a liturgy, and part of that liturgy was, "Come unto me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, take my yoke upon you and learn of me." And to me, that meant that if I took Jesus' yoke upon me, that he would reveal himself to me. So I prayed, or I felt that this was like, I'm getting sort of tangled up my words now, but I prayed, "Jesus, I don't know if you exist or not, but I'll try you out. I'll give you control of my life. I'll take your yoke upon me, and you reveal yourself to me." And I really believe that's the point at which I became a Christian. And I didn't have an understanding of sin at that point, or the atonement, or any of those things. But as I continued to read the Bible, it was a completely different situation. It was electrifying, and it suddenly all started to make sense. And within certainly a month or so, I knew that all the basic Christian doctrines were true. That's basically the way the universe is. And then since then, I've had just continuing very personal interaction with Jesus, and really
through a life of faith.
Through a life of faith.
In the context of Princeton. If a student came to you, someone or a professor, a colleague, and said, "Dr. Suppy, I'm interested, I'm open to Christianity, but frankly, I'm just skeptical," what would you, if they asked for you, your main intellectual or historical reasons you think that Christianity is true, that show that it's really true, that this is reality, what would you say to them?
Well, I think it is very important to really listen to people and see what their specific concerns are. Sometimes people bring up intellectual concerns as kind of a shield and a barrier, and it is useful to deal with those, to essentially remove those defenses. But my sense is around campus that intellectual concerns are not always too strong in people becoming Christians. It wasn't a major issue for me, but it's more of a question of how do you find out whether this is really true or not. And I would say that by my experience, it's really experiencing the power of God is one of the important things. And I remember one time there was a Chinese scholar who's a computer scientist was living with us in our home, and he was working on this very difficult machine language computer program, and there was some bug in it. He was very concerned about this, and he couldn't find it, and he wasn't a Christian. But one morning he was sharing with my wife and I about this again, and my wife and I decided to pray with him about this and just ask the Lord to reveal to him this error. And he came back that evening, and he was just elated and excited that he had found the bug in the program. And so that's something that you cannot consider as just an intellectual issue. This is confronting God's actions. And, around the university, we can argue any side of any question, and intellectual questions are often used in that way. And
as like a game.
Right, and it's a way of avoiding the real issues of confronting God.
What do you see to be the real issues that hinder the ordinary person from facing up to the possibility that Christ may be God coming in? In other words, is it like specific ethical, moral issues, jealousy, pettiness?
Well, I think certainly around the university there's lots of that. We have lots of bright and strong-minded people. And I think many people really do feel a need, not when they're flying high, but when they really get entangled in these sorts of conflicts, they really do start to feel that the reality of sin. They might not phrase it that way, but that's a time at which I think they're much more open to these things.
Well, in regard to the Christian faith, certainly the credibility of Christianity rests on the resurrection of Christ, and so that would be the pinnacle event that upon which we would be grounding our faith on, the death and the resurrection of Christ. A colleague or a student comes to you and says, Dr. Suppy, how can you buy the resurrection? I mean, how can you be a scientist and believe in the intervention and miraculous raising of a dead man? How would you reply to that?
Well, that would be I wouldn't give them a one-sentence reply on that.
I'm glad you wouldn't, by the way.
But it's really something they have to work through. And I mentioned I started by reading the Gospel of Mark. I started to realize that perhaps it is possible that the universe is created, and how do we find this out? And obviously, if you were God and decided to that you wanted to interact in some way, and we were the ants, and you don't just sort of yell at the ants, but one way you might do it is to become an ant, and obviously there are liabilities in that. There's ample opportunity for confusion. You can say, well, I'm God, and I can say, well, you're crazy, and so there is a reasonableness for Jesus to be God come to earth.
Okay. And I appreciate your sharing that. Dr. Suppy, as you look back over 7 or 8 years of the tradition of inviting in a Christian scholar, a top mind in the Christian camp, to speak here on the Princeton campus, sponsored by you all, sponsored by the Christian faculty group. I think you've had Dr. Vitz, the psychologist from NYU, speak on atheism, a Christian perspective on that, and Dr. Thaxton on the origin of DNA, and Dr. Yamauchi on the resurrection. What would you say are some of your favorite highlights? In other words, what do you think? What do you feel was the worthwhileness of that project or those lectures, and what were maybe some of your favorite moments in those series?
Well, it's interesting to talk to other people that went to these lectures. Different people respond in different ways. People are coming from different perspectives. But for me, it was actually Al Planiga, who's really, I would say, the leading Christian philosopher. And I actually got to meet him then, and I've had an ongoing relationship with him, and I think he's been a very personally stimulating person.
Did your brother, who's a professor, I believe, of philosophy of science?
That's right.
Was he influenced through Dr. Plania?
Well, they're good friends, and my brother actually did become a Christian at age 50, and was.
And he was a professor also.
Yeah,
At that point.
Yes, yes, and in fact, my brother organized a conference on epistemology of science and Christianity. That is, how do we know in science and how do we know in Christianity? And that was, Al Planiga was involved in that, and I actually gave a paper on that. And
Great.
It was a very exciting time a couple of years ago.
Well, I can recall the shock, my shock at seeing a packed audience to hear Dr. Yamauchi, this famous historian of the ancient Near East, give a talk at Princeton on the credibility, the historical credibility of the resurrection.
That's right. I enjoyed that talk very much.
Yeah, I could put a plug in here and say that we have copies of both the tape and the paper, but I won't plug that. Just did. Let me move on to one or two other questions.
Sure.
What books that you have read in your career as a Christian professor of geology here at Princeton, what books, it doesn't have to be on apologetics, but anything that has maybe encouraged you and helped you, given you some input and some impacted your own thinking here as a Christian on campus?
Right. I would say that the two things. First of all, particularly as a new Christian and on since then, I've read quite a few biographies of strong Christians, missionaries, people like that, particularly 20th century, 19th, 20th century. And that was a tremendous inspiration for me to see how God worked through these people, through their lives. And sometimes it wasn't until they were 70 years old that the Lord really had them in a position where He could really use them. And that was encouraging to me. And then I've also looked into the history of missions quite a bit, and even took a course out in Pasadena on that, and just to see how God has worked in carrying out His plan that He really states to Abraham.
To bless all the families, all the nations.
How He's worked through that, through the Old Testament, the New Testament, and then through church history. And how, in fact, even in the last century and this century, that really is being accomplished. And sometimes in North America, we don't see that. But Africa, south of the Sahara, for example, has become dominantly Christian in this century. And it's a remarkable revolution that's going on right now worldwide.
Appreciate your pointing that out. Finally, what do you find giving you courage as a Christian in what is dominantly a secular environment? University campuses around the country are not exactly known as cocoons that are, encouraging people toward a Christian faith necessarily. But what do you find giving you courage to stand and to be for your presence in that environment as a Christian professor?
Well, I would say, really knowing God in a mature way, then you know who you are and whose you are.
Whose you are, I like that.
And, if you have uncertainty in your faith, then it's rough. But if you really know who you are and whose you are and what your role is to be, my role is not just to be a geologist here. And as I told you earlier, the Lord really showed me that He wanted me to be a witness.
Thank you so much for your time. Enjoyed having you.
Great time.
Appreciate it very much.